Liberal journalist mocks Jason Statham on live TV. What happens next leaves the audience speechless. Watch as the action star turns ridicule into revelation in this unforgettable interview that's inspiring millions. Like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on this powerful story of grace, grit, and the strength of silence. The studio lights shimmered like polished glass as they bathed the set of the Evening Exchange, a late-night show known as much for its dazzling production as for its firebrand host. Cassidy Lane, a media icon and unapologetic liberal firestarter, sat atop the progressive food chain with her biting commentary and relentless political satire. She was adored by millions, celebrated on social media, and feared by her guests. Her desk, sleek and curved like the edge of a blade, faced the audience with theatrical flair. Behind her, a digital skyline glowed, a beacon of modernity and metropolitan dominance. Cassidy wasn't just a host. She was a cultural force, a symbol of a new generation of unapologetic thinkers who didn't just question authority. They tore it apart in real time, one viral clip at a time. Every night, Cassidy walked a tightrope between cultural critique and comedic annihilation, and she'd never once lost her balance. Politicians, celebrities, and corporate moguls alike had faced her merciless takedowns, and while some stumbled through awkward rebuttals, others crumbled entirely under her surgical sarcasm. It wasn't cruelty, Cassidy insisted, it was clarity. So when a name Jason Statham surfaced during a producer meeting for next week's guest lineup, the room practically buzzed with the electricity of opportunity. "You mean the action guy?" Cassidy asked, leaning forward in her chair. "The one who plays the same scowling punch machine in every movie?" Her lead writer chuckled. "Exactly. The walking embodiment of British testosterone. I mean, the guy basically grunts for a living." Cassidy's eyebrows arched like a cat sizing up prey. "Oof. You know what? Book him." There were smirks around the room. Everyone understood what was about to unfold. Jason Statham wasn't just a Hollywood tough guy. He was a cultural relic. In Cassidy's eyes, he represented everything her audience loved to dismantle. Traditional masculinity, stoicism over vulnerability, and the kind of cinematic bravado that had aged like expired protein powder in the wake of evolving cultural conversations. Cassidy's mind began racing. This wasn't just another guest. It was a chance to turn the archetype of the alpha male into a punchline. She could already hear the laughter, see the pull quotes, imagine the Twitter threads. Statham gets stomped. Cassidy versus Caveman. This would be one for the books. But a few hundred miles away, on the sun-washed patio of a quiet London flat, Jason Statham sat sipping espresso in silence. The invitation to appear on the Evening Exchange lay on the table beside his phone. A faint breeze rustled the paper. His longtime friend and manager, George, stood by the door, arms crossed. "You don't have to do this, mate." Cassidy Lane's not exactly rolling out a red carpet. She's looking for blood. Jason glanced at the letter, then up at the sky. "She wants to talk. Let her talk." George hesitated. "It's not a talk. It's theater. It's bait." Jason smiled faintly, the kind of smile that only comes from years of being underestimated. "I've been in worse rooms than hers." He picked up the letter and folded it carefully. "If she wants to throw punches, let her. Just means she's expecting one back. You gonna give her one?" Jason stood and drained the rest of his espresso. "No, I'll give her something better." Back at the studio, Cassidy was deep in prep mode. Her team had compiled clips of Jason's movies, interviews, public statements, anything that could be used to challenge him, embarrass him, or just make him squirm. Her notebook was filled with clever barbs. "You've punched more faces in a malfunctioning ATM," she read aloud with a smirk. "Save that for the second act. What about this one? You've built a career out of being silent and sweaty. How's that going for you in the era of emotional intelligence?" Her writers laughed. Cassidy wasn't just preparing for an interview. She was arming for a war of wit. Meanwhile, Jason boarded a flight with zero entourage, dressed in jeans, boots, and a soft leather jacket. No rehearsals, no handlers, no nerves. He read a paperback on the plane, Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and slept through the turbulence. When he arrived at the studio on the day of the taping, the contrast between him and the surrounding chaos was stark. Producers buzzed with energy, assistants paced with clipboards, makeup artists rushed back and forth. Jason entered quietly, shook a few hands, and sat down in the green room with a bottle of water. In the hallway outside, Cassidy and her producer Veronica reviewed the final rundown. "You sure you're ready for this one?" Veronica asked. Cassidy flashed a confident smile. "Please, this guy thinks vulnerability is a kind of carb. It'll be like boxing with a statue." The audience filed in, their chatter charged with anticipation. Cassidy's show was known for fireworks, and tonight promised nothing less. The lights dimmed, the theme music thundered, the curtain rose. Cassidy Lane took the stage like a conductor taking command of a symphony. The crowd roared. She delivered her opening monologue with razor-sharp timing, tackling politics, pop culture, and climate change, before pivoting smoothly into the night's guest. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's guest is Jason Statham, action icon, professional brooder, and possibly the only man alive whose heart rate doesn't change during an explosion. Laughter erupted. She smiled, soaking in the energy. Jason's here tonight to talk about, well, I guess punching things? Or grunting? Or maybe how to look angry in slow motion while walking away from car flip. Whatever it is, it'll be fun. The band played his intro. The curtains parted, and Jason Statham walked out, calm as a monk. No smirk, no swagger, just steady steps and a firm handshake. Cassidy leaned in as he took his seat. "Jason," she said, her smile bright and barbed, "welcome to the evening exchange. Don't worry, we kept the furniture nailed down just in case." The crowd chuckled again. Jason's lips curled into the faintest smile. "Appreciate that. I tend to get jumpy when people start throwing mugs." Laughter. He leaned back in his chair, posture relaxed. Cassidy, not missing a beat, launched into the next jab. "So let's get right into it. You made a career out of playing the same guy in every movie, the tough, silent type who solves problems with his fists. Have you ever considered, I don't know, acting?" The audience roared. Jason chuckled softly. "I act," he said, "every time I have to sit through a movie premiere where someone asks if I do my own stunts." The audience laughed again, but Cassidy narrowed her eyes. His tone was calm, confident without arrogance. She pressed on. "But seriously," she said, "don't you think the world's kind of moved past that kind of macho posturing? I mean, we're in an age where vulnerability is strength. And your characters, well, they're allergic to therapy." More laughter. She was in her element. Jason didn't flinch. "Funny thing about vulnerability," he said, leaning in slightly, "it's not something you perform. It's something you live. And sometimes the strongest people are the ones who don't need to talk about it all the time. They just show up. Every day. No applause. No speeches." Cassidy paused. A small wave of silence washed over the crowd. Jason continued, his voice low but steady. "People think because you don't cry on cue, you're not feeling. That because you're quiet, you're not thinking. But sometimes the loudest room isn't the one where people are talking. It's the one where someone finally starts listening." Cassidy blinked. That wasn't in the script, and neither was the sudden stillness in the room. She glanced at her next question, the one about Jason's politics, his problematic comments about society and toughness. But something shifted in her chest. A flicker of doubt. A warning not to fire the next shot too quickly. Jason sat there, waiting, calm, unbothered, ready for whatever came next. And just like that, the audience leaned in, not toward Cassidy but toward him. And that was the moment the balance began to shift. The silence following Jason Statham's comment wasn't awkward. It was unnerving. Cassidy Lane had crafted a reputation on always being 2 steps ahead, never letting a guest dictate the tempo of an interview. But now, she found herself leaning back just slightly in her seat, her rehearsed rhythm stalling like a car in the wrong gear. Jason hadn't dodged her jab. He hadn't even blocked it. He'd absorbed it like stone absorbs rain, and replied with something deeper. It unsettled her. But Cassidy Lane wasn't someone who yielded ground. Not even for a second. Not even for Jason Statham. She tapped her note cards twice, a little harder than usual, then smiled, too brightly. "Well, that's very poetic," she said, voice sweet and steely. "But let's not pretend the brooding silence in your movies is some kind of emotional depth. You've played essentially the same character since The Transporter. Do you ever worry that audiences are just bored? Gasps and laughter from the audience. The crowd stirred again. The game was back on. Jason's brow furrowed ever so slightly, as if you were trying to remember whether The Transporter came out in 2002 or 2003. He looked at Cassidy with quiet eyes. "I think people are only bored," he said after a pause, "when what they're watching doesn't feel real." Cassidy blinked. "And punching a helicopter feels real to you?" "No," he said, cracking the first real grin of the night. "But trying to protect something you care about does." That's what those characters are doing. They're not just fighting. They're fighting for something. There was a shift in the room. It was small but real. Cassidy wasn't deterred. And what exactly are they protecting? Their muscles? Their fragile egos? I mean, let's talk about masculinity. Your characters are the blueprint for every emotionally constipated teenager who thinks crying is for weaklings and talking about feelings is unmanly. Is that really the legacy you want to leave behind? Boom. There it was. The punch. The one she'd been saving. The audience reacted instantly. A mixture of applause, laughter, and gasps. It was classic Cassidy. She'd brought the conversation to its cultural breaking point and wrapped it in irony. She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "You've had a platform for years, Jason. Don't you think it's time you used it for more than car chases and brooding stares?" Jason didn't move. He didn't blink. He just sat there, letting her words hang in the air like smoke after a firecracker. Then, slowly, he leaned forward too. "I grew up in a council flat in South London," he said, voice low and calm. "We didn't talk about feelings. Not because we thought it was weak, but because most days were spent figuring out how to make it to the next one. My old man worked 3 jobs. My mom cleaned houses. I left school early to help out." The audience stilled. "I didn't grow up reading self-help books or watching TED Talks. I grew up watching people survive. So when I play those characters you say are emotionally constipated, maybe I'm not trying to glorify them. Maybe I'm trying to honor them." Cassidy's smile faltered just enough for the cameras to catch it. Jason's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. There's a whole world of men out there who've never been told it's okay to feel, who've been taught to carry their pain quietly because no one ever asked them how they were doing. Not once. And the only thing worse than never learning how to express your pain is being mocked when you finally try. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "I'm not saying I'm perfect," he continued. "I'm saying I'm learning. But I didn't get here through lectures. I got here by living. And if someone sees one of my movies and for 90 minutes forgets how heavy the world feels, if they see a guy who's messed up and flawed and still trying to do the right thing, then maybe that's not toxic. Maybe that's just human." Cassidy sat back in her chair. She hadn't expected this. And worse, she hadn't prepared for it. She glanced down at her cards. Her next question was about Jason's political opinions. An old interview where he'd expressed skepticism about celebrity activism. It was a strong pivot point, a chance to challenge him again. But something in his eyes made her pause. He wasn't deflecting. He wasn't defensive. He was just telling the truth. And the truth, inconveniently, was disarming. Still, she pressed on. "Okay," she said. "Fair enough. But you've also been criticized for staying silent on big social issues. You've got a massive platform. Why not use it to speak out more? Why not take a stand?" Jason looked down at his hands for a second, then back up at her. "Because shouting into a hurricane doesn't always help," he said. "And sometimes, if you're going to speak, it better be something worth hearing. Not just noise. Not just because people expect you to say something." Cassidy cocked her head. "Sounds like a cop-out." Jason shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just careful with my words. The world's full of people saying things just to be seen. I'd rather wait until I've got something worth saying." There was no applause this time. Just quiet. Thoughtful quiet. Cassidy, for once, didn't know what to say. She looked to the audience, then back at Jason, who sat like a man who had nothing to prove and everything to share. "Well," she said finally, "I guess this interview's not going how I expected." Jason smiled. "That makes 2 of us." The audience laughed, not mockingly but warmly. Cassidy nodded slowly, as if finally starting to realize that she wasn't just facing a movie star. She was facing a man. A full, complicated, self-made man who had been misunderstood not because he had nothing to say, but because no one had asked him the right questions. Until now. Still, Cassidy was Cassidy. She wasn't going to let the evening soften completely. She tapped her card one last time. "All right then," she said, recovering a touch of her trademark fire. "Let's talk about legacy. When you're done kicking down doors and jumping out of helicopters, what do you want people to say about Jason Statham?" Jason didn't hesitate. "That I showed up," he said. "That I worked hard. That I stayed real." He paused. "And maybe," he added, "that in a world obsessed with shouting, I wasn't afraid to listen." It was subtle. It wasn't a soundbite, but it landed. Cassidy looked down, then up, and for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like the one holding the mic. She felt like the one learning something. The band started to play lightly in the background, signaling the upcoming commercial break. Cassidy cleared her throat. "We'll be right back," she said, but her voice lacked the usual sharpness. "More with Jason Statham after this." The cameras cut. The lights dimmed slightly. Crew members rushed the stage to reset. Cassidy stayed seated, staring at her notes. Jason leaned over, voice low. "You all right?" She nodded. "Yeah, I just didn't expect you to be this." She trailed off, unsure how to finish the sentence. "Human," he offered. She looked at him, then smiled. "Yeah." As the commercial countdown began in the background, Cassidy found herself thinking not about the next question or the next laugh line, but about something far rarer. A real conversation. The applause that followed the commercial break was enthusiastic, but noticeably different from the raucous cheer that had greeted the start of the show. There was still energy, yes, but it had changed form. What had once been excitement, laced with anticipation of a public skewering, was now layered with curiosity, and maybe something closer to respect. Cassidy Lane adjusted her blazer during the short break, her mind uncharacteristically quiet. Her usual flurry of snappy remarks and inner monologue had faded, replaced by a feeling she didn't quite recognize. Not discomfort, not defeat, something deeper, something like introspection. She glanced across the desk. Jason Statham was exactly as he had been since the interview started. Calm, relaxed, legs crossed at the ankle, hands resting lightly on the arms of his chair. He didn't seem smug. He didn't seem like he'd won anything. In fact, he looked as though he were simply having a chat with an old friend. That, Cassidy realized, was the unsettling part. He wasn't performing, and the audience felt it too. As the lights brightened and the cameras rolled once more, Cassidy leaned forward. The usual grin was still there, but it softened. Something unspoken passed between them. A truce perhaps, or at least a ceasefire. "Welcome back," she said, looking into the camera. "We're here with Jason Statham, who, believe it or not, is making me question everything I thought I knew about action stars." The audience chuckled, and Jason gave a small nod of acknowledgement. Cassidy turned back to him. "All right, Jason, we've covered masculinity, vulnerability, legacy, but I want to go deeper. You said before that you grew up in South London. That life wasn't exactly easy. I think a lot of people would be surprised by that. You've become a global icon. Fast cars, luxury suits, red carpets, but that's not where you came from." Jason's eyes lowered slightly, his jaw tightening just enough for Cassidy to notice. "No," he said, voice low. "That's not where I came from at all." The audience leaned in. "I was raised in a place called Shirebrook Estate," he began, a rough bit of South London. "Back then, the whole world felt like concrete and council tax. My dad worked as a street seller. Hats, knockoff watches, whatever he could shift. My mum cleaned houses in Kensington. I watched them both break their backs just to put dinner on the table. Some nights, they'd skip meals so I could eat." There was no dramatization in his voice, just truth. "I learned early on that life doesn't hand you anything. You got to take it. Honestly if you can, creatively if you must." Cassidy folded her hands slowly, giving him space. "I didn't go to university," he continued. "Didn't have that path, but I did have diving. I was a pretty good diver, national level. I thought maybe that'd take me somewhere. It didn't. Got dropped from the British team right before the Olympics. Just like that, the dream evaporated. I was 20-something with no job, no degree, and a broken ego. The audience was silent. A few people visibly leaned forward in their seats. I started working market stalls with my old man, selling cheap perfume, leather jackets. And then one day, pure fluke, I get spotted by a guy from a clothing brand. He liked the way I stood, thought I had the look. Next thing I know, I'm modeling in catalogs and standing shirtless next to sports cars I couldn't afford to wash, let alone drive. He paused, letting the image settle. But it wasn't until Guy Ritchie came along that things changed. He saw something, cast me in lock, stock, and 2 smoking barrels. I didn't have acting experience, didn't have the training, but I had something more valuable. "What's that?" Cassidy asked softly. Jason looked at her. Hunger. A quiet murmur ran through the audience. "See, when you've had nothing," he continued, "and you get the chance to have something, you don't waste it." I didn't know how to act like the others did, but I knew how to be real. I knew how to bring something honest to the screen. Cassidy nodded slowly. This wasn't what she had expected, but she was drawn in now, just like everyone else. "You talk about your dad a lot," she said. "Was he your biggest influence?" Jason leaned back, exhaling slightly. "Yeah, he was. And not just because he worked hard. He was the first man I ever saw cry." That caught Cassidy off guard. Her eyes widened slightly. "Really?" Jason nodded. "I was 11. Mom got sick. Nothing serious, but she had to stay in hospital for a few nights. And I remember waking up and finding him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, head in his hands, crying quietly. He didn't know I was watching, but I saw it, and it stuck with me. Not because he cried, but because he didn't run from it. He let it happen. Then, the next morning, he got up, packed my school lunch, and went to work. Like he always did." Jason's voice didn't break, but something shifted in its tone. Warmer, fuller. "People think strength is about how much you can carry," he said. "But it's also about how honest you're willing to be when you're at your lowest. That's a different kind of strength." Cassidy sat still. No smirking, no sarcasm, just listening. And the audience, so conditioned to cheer on her sharp takedowns, was utterly silent. Not out of boredom, out of reverence. "I'm not trying to be a role model," Jason continued. "I'm not trying to lecture anyone. But if someone like me, who didn't finish school, who started with nothing, who's been punched more times than he can count, can find a way to be honest, then maybe it's okay for other people to be honest too. Maybe it's okay to say, 'I'm scared,' or 'I'm tired,' or 'I don't know what to do.'" He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping the rows of faces watching him. "Because the truth is, we're all carrying something. The trick is not to carry it alone." Cassidy swallowed. She hadn't meant to get emotional. But there it was, that ache in her chest. That quiet, painful tug of something real. "I've interviewed a lot of people," she said softly, "but I don't think I've ever heard anyone say it quite like that." Jason smiled. "You just needed a good punching bag." The audience laughed, and the moment softened. But its weight remained. Cassidy took a breath. "Jason," she said, "I have to be honest. I came into this interview ready to make you the punchline. I had the whole thing planned. Tough guy meets sharp tongue. And you just didn't take the bait." Jason shrugged. "Why would I? You weren't wrong." Cassidy blinked. "Come again." "You weren't wrong," he repeated. "I did play the same character for years. I did rely on silence and fists. And yeah, maybe I was part of a culture that glorified that. But people grow. And if you're lucky, you get the chance to outlive your mistakes." There was again that grace, that grounded self-awareness. Cassidy looked down at her hands. "You said earlier that the loudest room isn't always the wisest," she murmured. "I think I spent a lot of time being the loudest." Jason didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The audience, sensing the shift, remained still. Nobody checked their phone. Nobody whispered. They were all bearing witness to something rare. Not an interview, not a confrontation, but a connection. Cassidy exhaled slowly. "We're going to take another break," she said, voice softer than usual. "But when we come back, I want to hear more about how you got here, about what you've learned, because I think we all need to hear it." Jason nodded, and as the band played them into the next commercial, Cassidy sat back in her chair, not as a performer, not as a provocateur, but as a person who, for the first time in a long time, felt like she had something to learn. The second commercial break ended with an unusually subdued transition. The applause was still there, cordial, appreciative, but softer, more reverent. What had started as a late-night spectacle was now evolving into something altogether different. You could feel it in the air, like the quiet after a storm when all that remains is truth. Cassidy Lane sat with her elbows resting gently on the desk. The infamous smirk that usually danced at the corner of her mouth was gone, replaced by something far more honest: attentiveness. She had her next question in hand, a card scribbled with a quote from one of Jason's older interviews where he dismissed awards as ceramic pats on the back. But she didn't reach for the punchline. Not now. Not when a room had changed so dramatically. Jason Statham, still seated with that impossible calm, looked like a man who hadn't just been heard, but understood. Cassidy leaned in. "Jason," she said quietly, "before the break, you talked about the people who carry things in silence. About the weight. I think there are a lot of folks watching right now who needed to hear that. But I want to go deeper. Was there ever a moment in your life when that silence almost swallowed you?" Jason nodded slowly, as if he'd been expecting the question. "There was," he said. "A few, actually." The room, already hushed, grew impossibly still. "You know, people assume fame fixes you," he began. "Like once you get the money, the career, the fans, it patches all the holes you came with. But it doesn't. It just gives you shinier distractions." Cassidy nodded, saying nothing. "There was a point, maybe 10 years ago," Jason continued, "when everything looked perfect from the outside. I was headlining blockbusters, flying private, staying in 5-star hotels. But I never felt more lost." He paused, eyes distant. "There was one night, after a premiere in LA, I was back at my hotel. It was a beautiful place. Penthouse suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. And I remember standing there, drink in hand, looking out at all those lights and feeling absolutely nothing. A pin could have dropped. Empty," he said. "Completely hollow. I had everything I'd ever dreamed of, and none of it mattered. Not really." He glanced at Cassidy. She was frozen, eyes wide, breath held. "That was the first time I admitted to myself that I was lonely," he said. "Not just between people, but inside. Like there was a version of me that got lost somewhere between the stunts and the scripts." Cassidy swallowed. "What did you do?" Jason leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. "I called my brother," he said simply. "We hadn't spoken properly in months. Too busy, too successful, all that rubbish. I told him I didn't know who I was anymore. And he didn't lecture me. He didn't tell me to meditate or go to therapy. He just said, 'Come home.'" Jason's voice tightened just slightly. "So I did. I flew back to London, stayed at his place for a while. We drank tea, played cards, walked around our old neighborhood. No press, no photos. Just two blokes remembering who they used to be. And somewhere in that silence, I started to hear myself again. The audience didn't make a sound." Jason took a breath. "Fame's not the problem," he said. "It's forgetting who you were before it. That's what'll break you." Cassidy nodded slowly, visibly moved. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. She'd faced senators, tech moguls, and Hollywood elites. But none had unraveled her like this. "I think," she said quietly, "people see you in films and assume you've never doubted yourself. That you're just invincible." Jason chuckled. "I've been scared more times than I can count. Scared I wasn't good enough. Scared I'd lose it all. Scared I was just a lucky thug in a good suit. But fear's not the enemy. Silence is." "What do you mean?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "Fear is something you can work with. You can push through it, learn from it, even use it. But silence, that's where the lies grow. That's where the worst version of you starts whispering that you're a fraud, or a failure, or that you don't matter." Cassidy sat back in her chair, visibly affected. "Have you ever believed those lies?" she asked. Jason didn't flinch. "Absolutely," he said. "Every time someone told me I wasn't talented. Every time I read a review that said I was a one-note actor. Every time I walked into a meeting and saw that look, you know the one, that says he's not smart enough for this." He looked out at the audience. You start to internalize that stuff. You start to shrink. You don't even realize it's happening. You just smile more, talk less, go along with it, until one day, you don't recognize the guy in the mirror. "And what brought you back?" Jason thought for a moment. "A conversation," he said. Cassidy raised an eyebrow. With who? He smiled faintly. My mum. A gentle wave of warmth rolled through the audience. She came to visit one day, he continued. We were walking through Hyde Park, and I was complaining, whining really about critics, contracts, career stuff, and she stopped me, right there under this old oak tree. She looked me in the eye and said, Jason, I love you, but you're not that important. The audience laughed. Light, relieved laughter, but Jason's face stayed sincere. And she was right, he said. I'd built this whole identity around being important, around matching, around proving people wrong. And in that moment, she reminded me that I wasn't the center of the world. I was just her son, a bloke from South London who used to sell knockoff watches. Cassidy smiled, real, unguarded. There's something incredibly freeing, Jason added, about realizing you don't have to impress anyone. You just have to show up, do the work, be honest. A man in the second row wiped his eyes discreetly. A woman 2 seats overtook her partner's hand. Cassidy looked down at her cards again. They suddenly felt weightless. Irrelevant. Jason, she said, her voice cracking just slightly, I don't think I've ever listened to someone speak like this on this stage. Jason looked at her. No smugness, no performance, just calm. Maybe you weren't ready, he said. Cassidy blinked. Excuse me. Maybe the reason it's never happened before, he said gently, is because this show has always been about being right, being clever, getting the laugh, scoring the win. But tonight, you listened. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do, he said, is stop talking long enough to hear what you're missing. Cassidy Lane, queen of the mic drop, sat speechless. The studio was still, not tense, not uncomfortable, just still. And then, softly at first, came the applause. It wasn't prompted. It wasn't showy. It was real. Jason glanced toward the audience, nodding once. A simple acknowledgement. Cassidy looked out at the sea of faces. People who, just an hour ago, had come to laugh at a takedown were now on the edge of their seats, transformed by something far more compelling than conflict. Jason, she said finally, we have to wrap up soon. But if you could leave this audience with one thought, just one, what would it be? Jason thought for a moment. Don't let the world rush you, he said. Don't let it tell you who you're supposed to be before you've had the chance to find out for yourself. Take your time, pay attention, and don't be afraid to start over. The audience erupted, not with wild cheers, but with a standing ovation. Cassidy turned to him, eyes shining. Thank you, she said, and for once, the words weren't a sign-off. They were sincere, grateful. Jason simply nodded. Pleasure. And in that moment, under the bright lights of a stage once built for sarcasm, something truly rare had taken place. Not an interview, not a performance, a reckoning. The studio remained in a kind of suspended stillness long after the final camera had stopped recording. Normally, when an episode of the Evening Exchange wrapped, the atmosphere snapped back to motion. Crew members chatting, lights cooling, Cassidy's team already strategizing for the next viral clip. But not tonight. Tonight was different. Cassidy Lane stayed seated for a long moment, hands folded loosely in her lap, eyes fixed on the now empty chair across from her. Jason Statham had already exited the stage, offering a firm handshake to every crew member he passed and a simple nod to the audience. No grand finale, no farewell quip. Just the quiet departure of a man who had somehow left more behind than any celebrity ever had on that set. When she finally stood, Cassidy didn't head to her dressing room. Instead, she walked slowly through the hushed backstage corridor, passing walls lined with photos of previous guests, politicians, actors, authors, influencers, all locked forever in frames that celebrated controversy and sound bites. But none of those photos captured what had just happened, because what had happened tonight wasn't meant to be framed. It was meant to be remembered. In the green room, Jason was zipping his duffel bag. He'd changed out of the fitted blazer and crisp shirt into something simpler, gray hoodie, jeans, trainers. A man who could have blended into any street in any city. Cassidy stood at the door. She didn't speak immediately. Jason noticed her, smiled. That went better than expected. She gave a short laugh. Yeah, though probably not for the reasons either of us thought. He slung the bag over his shoulder and waited. "I wanted to take you down," she admitted. That was the plan. Clever lines. Big laughs. Same formula that's always worked. Jason just looked at her, calm, understanding. "But you didn't take the bait," she said. "You didn't even flinch." Jason stepped forward, his voice low. "That's because I wasn't here to win anything, Cassidy. I was here to talk." She nodded slowly. "Well, mission accomplished." There was a long pause between them, one not filled with tension, but with clarity. Then Cassidy extended her hand. "Thank you," she said. Jason shook it. "Thank you for listening." And then he was gone. Cassidy stood there for a few more seconds, her hand still slightly outstretched, as if the echo of the conversation still lingered in her palm. Then, finally, she turned and walked back to her dressing room, where she collapsed into the chair in front of her mirror. The lights above were too bright. Her reflection looked too put together for how she felt. She grabbed her phone. Dozens of notifications. Group chats buzzing. Trending tags. Mentions stacking by the second. Her show was going viral. But not because she'd been witty. Not because she dismantled someone live. Because she had been changed. She opened her email, typed a message to her team. Subject, tomorrow's show. Let's scrap the original lineup. I want to do something different. Something real. See? Then she opened Twitter. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hated sincerity online. It always felt forced, curated. But tonight she didn't care. She typed. Tonight wasn't takedown. It was a wake-up call. Thank you, at Real Statham, for reminding me, and all of us, that sometimes the strongest thing we can do is listen. She hit post. Sat back. Outside, the internet exploded. Clips from the interview circulated like wildfire. But not the snarky ones. Not the jabs. No one cared about Cassidy's one-liners anymore. They cared about Jason's story. His grace. His vulnerability. His strength. A clip of him saying, "Fear isn't the enemy. Silence is." Racked up 2 million views in under an hour. People tweeted, Jason Statham just taught a masterclass in masculinity. And it had nothing to do with fighting. Cassidy Lane came to mock him. Ended up learning from him. That wasn't an interview. That was a sermon. YouTube channels posted reaction videos. A college professor in Ohio showed the interview to her gender studies class. A school counselor in Toronto wrote a blog post about Jason's comments on silence and emotional suppression in men. It was shared across dozens of parenting forums. Even news anchors picked it up. But Jason didn't comment. Back in London, a few days later, he was seen helping his brother repaint the front of their mother's old house. No statement, no victory lap, just paint on his boots and a quiet smile. The interview would go down in television history as a turning point. Not because of Cassidy's barbs, but because of how they were met. Because of a man who didn't fight back, but invited forward. Who didn't defend himself, but revealed himself. And Cassidy Lane? She was never the same again. She changed her show format. Introduced a new segment, the Real Talk Chair. A weekly 5-minute space for guests to speak without being interrupted. No jokes. No rebuttals. Just space. Critics said she was softening. Her audience disagreed. Ratings soared. But more importantly, conversations changed. Men started writing in. Not to defend Jason, but to thank him. I watched that show with my son. And for the first time in years, we talked. Really talked. I didn't know how much I'd buried until I heard him say, "The worst version of you whispers when you're alone." That was me. Thank you. He made me realize I can still grow. Even at 52, Cassidy read every letter, every tweet, every email, and with every word, she realized something she'd never understood before. Wit is clever, intelligence is respected, performance is entertaining. But honesty? Honesty changes people. One night, months later, Cassidy found herself back in London for an event. As she stepped out of a car near Trafalgar Square, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. Hoodie, jeans, hands in his pockets. Jason. No cameras. No stage. Just 2 people on a sidewalk. They exchanged a nod. No words. But none were needed. She watched him disappear into the crowd. And somewhere deep inside, she smiled. knowing that she had faced a man built by silence, who had taught the world how to finally listen.